my mom was a teacher. She taught Spanish here in Long Beach. And my grandmother was a teacher. She was a kindergarten teacher and a children's librarian. And so I just was raised with a real joy of learning. There wasn't a lot of talk about you have to get an A and you have to do this. Luckily, I came from a family that deeply emphasized just learning for learning's sake, reading for reading's sake, that type of thing. So after college, I went off and traveled a little bit, and I got married and had kids, and I always knew, I wanted to take my kids and see the world, and a little bit like Sonia was saying, that was a little bit naive of me, because what really was happening was there were a lot of bills, there were braces, there were lessons, and so this whole idea of just taking off every spring break or this or that was proving to be a lot more difficult. So I always made sure to read to my kids all the time. That was one way we could sort of travel without traveling. But for a long time, I had a dream that I was just going to throw them all in the car one day, and we were going to take Mark Twain's idea to heart, don't let school stand in the way of your education, and we were going to test that theory. So last year I have 2 boys and 2 girls. So they were 14, 11, 9, and 6. So 8th grade, 5th grade, 4th grade, and 1st grade. And we jumped in the car and went across America. So, and the reason I have this up, some of my stuff's not coming up, is because in life we're all used to being pointed in one direction or another. Whether it's, a lot of it is because we have responsibilities, of course. We have to do what we have to do. And what I found myself doing was wondering what was going on over here. What was going on? I know life was trying to point me in this direction, especially when you're supposed to be a mom, cooking dinner, go to the PTA meeting, and that was sort of what it reminded me of, these road signs that point you in a direction. But I was just always wondering, the kind of person, well, what about what's behind the sign? What's on the other side? What's going on in where there are no signs, like the road less taken? So we, I planned out for many months. Of course, we couldn't see every single thing, but I tried to slow this down, but this was our path. I'm sorry, it was so fast. So we did everything from the Redwood Forest. We did an extensive civil rights movement unit in Alabama, and we stood where Rosa Parks was arrested. We went to Martin Luther King's house. We went to Washington, D.C. We went to national parks and saw wild animals, and we stayed on a farm in Iowa and learned all about corn, and we rode in a huge combine and helped harvest corn. And so it was, as I told my kids, a lot of people ask me, how did you test them? What kind of homework did you have? How were you the teacher? And the reality of it was, I was a student with them. I was 100% a student. So there were 5 students, and our teachers became the park rangers, people that we met on the street, museum docents. Those were our teachers, and every day that we went out, no matter what we did, we learned something. It was very few days. We had a couple down days where it was pouring rain and we just hung out, but for the most part, we learned every day. One thing I was very, very pleasantly surprised to learn about our country is, I know we all know about national parks, Yosemite and Yellowstone and this kind of thing, but the National Park Services was phenomenal because everything was free. So up here is That is near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where the first flight took place, the Wright brothers. And we learned so much by being there. Anytime a National Park Service is in charge of something, they have rangers who help with tour guides, give lectures. They have a little booklet for kids, and it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. My parents flew out and met us for the Wright brothers. My dad has always had an interest. He had a pilot's license, and flying was a big thing for him. So in terms of multi-generational travel, I just cannot say enough about these national park services. The one on the bottom is our guide at Gettysburg. And he was explaining to my kids how the cemetery came to be, the Gettysburg Cemetery. And at this moment, he was talking about actually the way they dug the graves, and how if the bodies stayed on the battlefield too long, they would actually explode because the gas, I mean, he went into such things you do not find in a textbook. And it was fascinating, things that I had never heard. So this picture over here, that's Martin Luther King Jr.'s boyhood home. And again, it's free. There's a whole visitor center. They take you into his home, and as much as possible, it's exactly the way it was when he grew up. I did not know this, but his sister still lives there in Atlanta and still attends the same church. And we didn't see her, but we did go to the church for a service, and it was great. It's funny because depending on the age of my kids, they really experience things differently at whichever developmental stage they were at. So when we came home and my kids went back to traditional school, the one thing my 6-year-old really got out of the Martin Luther King house, as we walked down the hall, there was Martin and his brother's room, and right across the hall was his sister's room with some dolls on the bed. And our tour guide said, now everything here is original except the dolls and the toys, because Martin and his brother used to tear apart their sister's doll. And this was like, oh my gosh, this Martin Luther King, I mean, we had seen the statue in Washington, D.C., and where he gave the I Have a Dream speech, and we had been, and he thought, it was this aha moment, this was a person, this was a child. This big Martin Luther King and all these posters, he ripped apart his sister's dolls. He couldn't believe it. And it just humanized so much for him that, yeah, these are real people. These aren't just people in books and on posters. And they were little too, just like you once. So when we got back to traditional school, it happened to be Martin Luther King weekend shortly after we returned. And he raised his hand. And the teacher, I guess, asked if anyone knew who Martin Luther King was. And he went on to attempt to explain this whole situation about how he would tear apart his sister's doll. No one had any idea what he was talking about. And his teacher had said something, and I knew right away. I said, oh yeah, this was a big deal on our trip, and I explained it. So it was just, every day was, you would set out to learn one thing, and it just, the incidental learning was just exploding every day. It just inspired every day. The one thing we did do was I set up an economy for my kids, because I knew we would be in places, and I didn't want for the whole semester to be nickel and dime. Can I have this? Can I have this snow globe of Mount Rushmore? And I did not want to have that happen. So the economy we set up was, they all had there was a list of jobs, and each one was worth a certain amount of money. And every week they invoiced me, and they gave me what jobs they did. Jobs were things like, for my little one, I had to make up things like the bed monitor. So every time we left somewhere, he was in charge of looking under the bed. And we had the igloo, the ice chest, the person who cleaned out the ice chest, the person who cleaned out the car. We had laundry duty. And of course, just as in life, the harder you worked, the more you made. And they quickly learned that some jobs were more desirable and more cushy, and some were just a little dirty and more grunt work. So along the way, they learned that if someone was lazy across the state of South Dakota, well, when we got somewhere a little more exciting for them, they wished they hadn't been, because they had not, their paychecks, which was cash, they just didn't have as much money as maybe the other people who were working hard. What ended up happening was my oldest son, he became the one who pumped gas and cleaned the windows at the gas station, and my daughter, who's very neat and orderly, naturally became the one who cleaned out the car. So they kind of found their niche along the way. So we sort of had a couple things going on. We had our economy, and then we have the learning. And the other thing that was really, really central and integral to this trip was our literary travel. This, to me, was the piece that I would like to keep going, even if we never went anywhere again. So I paired up books with experiences, and I don't know if any of you have heard of Dewey, the library cat. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you haven't, Dewey is a real cat who was found in a small town called Spencer, Iowa, in the drop box of a library. The librarian, on a bitter, bitter cold winter morning, heard a cat meowing and found that someone had put him, he was almost frozen, in a drop box. And we had read the book, and we went to Spencer, Iowa, and toured the library and met the librarian had since retired, but one of the women that still worked there gave us a tour, and my son got to go in the drop box where Dewey was found, which you can imagine was very, very exciting. So this idea of books, there's kind of a push right now, and I don't want to get on this soapbox, but in education right now, there's a real push for the test scores, and that really detracts from using books as a tool, as a springboard for expanding kids' imaginations and critical thinking and excitement and joy. So you don't know much if you score high on a test. It might not live in your heart. You know, we all have characters that when we finish the book, we think, oh, I'm so glad someone thinks and feels just like that. And so I wanted books to stay with them, and Spencer, Iowa, who knew, was a highlight of our trip. Another one was Harriet Tubman. She was born and raised in Maryland, and I am embarrassed to admit that I did not know that. I always pictured her with the Underground Railroad somewhere in the Deep South, and so when I did my research and we read about it, we did a bicycle tour that was based on Harriet Tubman's life. So it's called I don't know if any of you have been to Tidewater, Maryland. Okay, I hadn't, but the Tidewaters come up so high, it's almost like we can't even imagine. But one of the reasons we learned that Harriet Tubman was able to escape to the north was because she walked for miles and miles in water, shallow water, and left little evidence behind. So we got to see where she lived, where her parents lived, and it was all on bikes, and it was fascinating. And what that did was it sparked my children's curiosity and wanting to read more about her. Of course, there's countless books written about Harriet Tubman, and that was another highlight. Where the Red Fern Grows was always a real favorite of mine, and so although it's sad, often the story behind the story is the thing that is really fascinating. So Wilson Rawls, who wrote Where the Red Fern Grows, grew up in abject poverty and was very embarrassed of his lack of formal training as a writer. He wrote hundreds of stories, but didn't show anyone. He was so poor at times that he would write in paper that he would find in a trash can. He would write with a stick in the sand. Anything he could do to write. But before he got married, he had a trunk full of stories, one of them being what later became Where the Red Fern Grows, and he burned every bit of it. They were all burned because he never wanted his wife to see this and think less of him. So he, I guess, became a little more comfortable and sort of hinted around that he had these stories and told his wife about this book about this boy and these hunting dogs. And she said, "You absolutely have to write this story. This is incredible." So, of course, this is before we have computers or anything like this. And she left him alone. And in 2 weeks, from memory, he hand wrote the entire book again, second time. And he gave it to her to read, and he said, "I can't even be here when you read it. I'm leaving." So he came back, and she was crying, and she said, it became her mission. You need to publish this book. It was going to be an adult book. And so I was so giddy about going to Idaho. Idaho Falls is where he wrote the book, and they have this statue of Billy and Old Dan and Little Ann from the book as a tribute to Wilson Rawls right in front of the Idaho Falls Library. Again, who would have thought Idaho Falls would have been a huge highlight of our trip? But we went into the library and we actually saw an original copy that he had signed. It was, and if nothing else, my kids, I wanted them to understand that even if you don't feel in your heart that you're really good at something, you have to just don't give up, keep going. So that was another real big highlight. And then, of course, Hannibal, Missouri, of course, Mark Twain. Huge fan of Mark Twain. So we spent a couple days there and painted the Tom Sawyer fence and learned all about Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer, and went through the caves that inspired the cave scene in Tom Sawyer. And the thing that was amazing about that is I had not realized in school we learn things in little sections of the chapter, and then once that chapter's over, you move on to the next chapter. But what happened was soon after the next stop after Hannibal was Springfield, Illinois, where the Abraham Lincoln Library. And the connection that we made, an example of an assignment I gave my kids was Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln go to dinner. Now, some kids didn't know that Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain were alive at the same time period, and some kids and some adults don't realize Mark Twain's life was greatly impacted by the Civil War. We think of Mark Twain as Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. We think of Abraham Lincoln as the Civil War, but they lived at the same time. So Mark Twain's dream of being a steamboat pilot, we all learned about that, but we didn't realize that 3 years into it, when the Civil War broke out and they started blowing up these steamships, his dreams were taken away and he had to figure something else out. So I assigned, one of the assignments I had my teenage son do was Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln go to dinner. It's 1862. What do they talk about? Who pays? You know, Mark Twain became an abolitionist after being raised with slaves. Had he turned, you know, this is the critical thinking I'm talking about, really imagining these two men, who was older, how much older, and to think these are real people who were affected. So I tried to keep a balance between learning and fun, experience, hands-on stuff, but we did do a little bit of work too. So one of the other highlights of the trip was when we made it from one coast to the other. That was really fun. When we first saw the Atlantic Ocean, it was at the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and so that was cause for a lot of celebration, a lot of cheering. Woo, we did it! My husband came with us the first 11 days and flew home, and then he flew out and did Missouri and Springfield, and he flew out one more time. So we weren't always alone. And just like Sonia was saying, we really, really bonded, for better or for worse. My kids only had each other to play with, And that proved it to be the best thing ever. It really did. It was, if I could do it again, I would in a heartbeat. And so this was a picture taken in Tennessee. I just like it because, again, this shows the road and the different choices, represents the different choices you have. And some of our best moments were just the very quiet country roads when we were off the beaten path and we could just talk and listen to books on tape. And those were definitely some of the best moments that we had. But I will take questions if anyone has any, but I just wanted to mention my book is, I have not written the book about my trip yet. I'm a newspaper columnist, and after I was a teacher for a while, I stayed home to raise my kids. I'd always written, but I have a column called Mom's Voice. It's a reflections on life type of column. And My Laundry Museum and Other Messy Gifts of Motherhood was a book I was finishing while I was on the trip. So I haven't finished this next book. But the idea behind that is similar to what we found on the trip. In the laundry room one day, I just like I do normally, found some stuff in my son's pocket, and I was about to throw it away, and I stopped myself, and I thought, you know what, this is pretty funny. I'm gonna just start collecting everything, and I just called it my laundry museum. It's just a jar, and every time I would find whether there was a penny or a fortune cookie or whatever. I mean, I found a cork, rocks, googly eye, you name it. With 4 kids, you find things all the time. And those are actually things from my real laundry museum. Those are my son's jeans. But the point of the laundry museum and the point of the trip as well is just that it reminded me, even when I'm not out traveling and I'm not out doing this, that finding joy in everything we do, finding meaning, finding magic in the mundane is really, really what it's about, and that is what my column is about. So, some people say, well, I can't take off 3 months or 4 months work, or I can't afford that, but it doesn't mean that we can't explore, use the internet, and just find the magic in everything. So I say, if you can find joy between the lint and never-ending stream of dirty socks, you can find joy everywhere, every day. And so that's why over there is the laundry list. That is the book that will be out in a couple weeks. And that's it. Thank you so much.
How long was your trip?
Our trip was 3 months. Yeah, it went by quick.
And when was this?
We got back last Thanksgiving. We just got back a little while ago. Yeah, so that's why I'm not done with that book. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. And Sonia has generously offered to donate 20% of the proceeds from all the books you buy tonight. So